I'm very pleased to see you here on the Twin Cities campus, and I hope to be able to be seen by those on our system campuses in Crookston, Morris, Duluth, and Rochester as we get going. Chancellor Bear at Morris actually had the idea of getting this group together for a system-wide conversation, and so I hope she'll be able to join shortly. We're very pleased to welcome back Alan Berkovitz, who is here. Very good. Thank you. You really inspired us during your visit last fall and gave us a great kickoff and have enabled us to move this forward. You are indeed the expert, and we're very pleased to have you again with us, Alan. Thank you. And of course, a thank you to John and Karen for ably co-chairing this initiative and getting us going forward. As I said in my State of the Youth speech a week ago, wow, time flies. This is one of my very highest priorities. Presidents, as they get old, think about legacies, and I hope part of my legacy is setting the foundation for a new way to manage sexual misconduct and actually limit and ultimately prevent sexual misconduct on this campus. So I appreciate your work on this. It is an effort to change culture. Cultures are hard to change, almost by definition. I can't do it by myself, but with your help and leadership and the engagement of the community, I think we can make real progress. It's a very much a collaborative effort and a chance to really harness everybody's good work and good intentions to enable our community to be a better place for everybody. We really must eliminate these kind of events to the greatest degree possible. One instance of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, sexual assault is one too many. And I know you share my passion about changing where we are in this space. So thank you again. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you, and I'll turn the podium to John Finnegan to get you started on your work. I hope you have a very productive and useful day today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, everybody, for being here for this workshop. I guess we all were able to get here with our dog sleds and other things today, so everything is fine. Okay. This is going to be really continuing, I think, a level of training, a level of expansion of our knowledge, a level of expansion of our commitment to this, and I'm very delighted to have Alan here for his second visit, as the President indicated. I've got a couple of remarks I want to make about the approach that we've been taking and how we are thinking of this in terms of the public health approach. And I would say this just at the beginning, and you know, being a communications person, I have a strong belief. You tell people what you're going to say, you tell them, and then you tell them what you just said. Okay, and somewhere in there it creates sticky stuff that stucks in the brain. So I will tell you at the outset, and I'm going to do a little more detail, that there are three kinds of characteristics that I think you could say really do describe the public health approach. One is, public health is about redefining the unacceptable in terms of problems and challenges. Redefining the unacceptable. The second characteristic is going upstream. So we go upstream and we look at root causes. And sometimes we can't do anything about those root causes. I get that. And you might work more midstream when you figure that out. But we want to go upstream as far as we can to deal with the root causes of the challenges that we face. There are many examples we could talk about there. And the third characteristic that you need to keep in mind is collective action. Okay? When we talk about public health, it's collective action that makes the difference. Now, that all sounds like, oh, well, that's neat. It's nice. I'll tied it all up. It sounds really good. Any of you that have been involved in this effort, any of you that have been involved in public health know that we're talking about long-term, committed action that is difficult, that is time-consuming, that requires us to think in the design thinking kind of mode. Okay, so keep that in mind, and because we'll be coming back to that in a minute here. If you have had a chance to go admire that beautiful Northrop Auditorium and its, its newly revised version, you will see that one of the things we kept was the phrase that's chiseled on the cornice of the building at the very top: ennobled by understanding, dedicated to the advancement of learning and the search for truth. I love that phrase. So part of this initiative really arises because this university is a learning community, and it is dedicated to supporting each other in the achievement of our aspirations and our dreams, whatever they may be. We are the dream-making machine. We are the machine that helps people realize their dreams of a better future. And so, to paraphrase Carl Rogers, the very famous psychologist, we are driven to express and activate all of our capacities as human beings. So everyone who works, plays, learns in our university community, we believe, has a right to a climate and a culture that sustains the conditions that make those aspirations and dreams possible. I say that because it's important that we understand that this is the right thing to do, and that's where this is really coming from, in my view. So violence of any kind in this culture really belies that right, and that's part of what I think has happened here in terms of redefining the unacceptable. There is a spectrum of behavior that we are concerned about here. As you know, rape and sexual assault reflect the criminal side of that spectrum. The physical and psychic violence that survivors experience is horrific. We also are concerned about bullying, berating, and the less obvious forms of sexual harassment and misconduct that not only do psychic damage to the individual who experiences those, but also poisons the culture and the mental health of our entire university community. So we are not alone in these challenges. This is not unique to this university or any institution in our society. All of us face those challenges, as we've seen in the emerging Me Too movement, and as you may have seen if you watched the Oscars the other night. Frances McDormand's comments were especially fascinating, and I'm not sure that most of the people in the country know what an inclusion rider is, but they will know in the not-too-distant future. So the difference with a university, though, is that because we're so focused on learning, we are choosing to create the culture that makes that learning and the achievement of our missions as humanly achievable as we can. And that means making a culture as free of sexual violence as we can possibly make it. So, as I mentioned, when we talk about taking a public health approach, that includes some very specific mindsets and conditions in which people can be helpful. Public health is what we do to collectively assure the conditions that can help keep people healthy. So in that context, public health is also the continuous redefinition of the unacceptable, as I mentioned at the outset. And I believe that our university has reached a point where the spectrum of behavior that the president has described, as well as the conditions that give rise to it, are no longer acceptable. So I want to be clear that there are so many people on this campus that have been doing this kind of work for a very long time. We're not the first to address these issues. This has been something that the sometimes lonely voices in the wilderness have been talking about for a very long time. And we recognize that, and we build on the work that they have done and over the years. It's taken a while for our culture to catch up with where they were, but that is happening now, and we honor that commitment of theirs in the past. So engagement, empowerment across all university communities is an enormously powerful force, and we thank them for helping to contribute to that. So the public health approach is driven by evidence about root causes, as I mentioned. It's incorporating evidentiary best practices wherever possible and into a framework of design thinking about strategies. Every challenge or problem that we deal with is different in its components. And that's one aspect about public health. It needs to be flexible. It needs to be able to understand how conditions are the same and how they're unique with specific issues. So it accounts for outcomes, and it also seeks continuous quality improvement in knowledge, and as our knowledge as our experience actually accumulates. So we use this upstream downstream metaphor to characterize what we do. Upstream is understanding the root causes. We ask the question, what can we do as a community to reduce those causes or to change those conditions before it occurs? And that is primary prevention. That is way upstream. Downstream of that is secondary prevention. In this case, we ask, what can we do to reduce the risk of this behavior and its impact? And in the case of sexual violence, for example, we know that excessive alcohol consumption can amplify risk. It doesn't cause sexual assault, but it can amplify that risk. And finally, farther downstream, we enter the realm of providing support and recovery services to those who've experienced sexual violence, harassment, or other misconduct. As I mentioned, in the public health framework of a challenge like this, success requires the proactive intervention of a fully engaged community. That's the collective action. And there's a few things that we know from the history of public health. A single intervention or disconnected interventions will not change conditions sufficiently to reduce violence and harassment against women or others. Scattershot does not work. The key insight is to develop mutually reinforcing synergistic intervention strategies that integrate comprehensively to address change at multiple levels. That's where it gets complicated beyond just the simple statement of the three principles I gave. But we also have to recognize that within our community there are different groups at different levels of risk for different forms of sexual violence, harassment, or other misconduct. So to summarize this initiative is about long-term, committed, sustained action. It requires us to think in terms of a spectrum of behavior that shapes our community and our culture, and it requires us to examine how our university community and aspects of its cultures have themselves built and sustained this culture of violence and other misconduct. What is our institutional responsibility and accountability, and what do we do to improve that? And this effort is also going to require training and skills building with a focus on social norms and bystander action. We're going to hear much more about that. It requires us to think carefully about the conditions of risk that affect groups, and it requires us to consider the policy and institutional accountability and responsibility to support the change that we want and that we need. And if we are successful, we will see more complaints. That's the paradox of this kind of activity, because, as we know, it has been grossly underreported over the years. And as we change the culture, and as people feel the institution supports them, you're going to see a rise in complaints. That's not a defeat. That's actually a mark of success. In the long run, the true mark of success is how we deal with that and how we change the culture for prevention. Thank you very much. It is now my great pleasure to reintroduce Alan Berkovitz. As you know, Alan came here last year, really helped us to think through what this very large and complicated university was going to do in this particular area. And I hope that you have had a chance to take a look at Alan's vita. If you have, you know that Alan is one of the nation's leading figures in this area. He has consulted widely. He is a licensed consulting psychologist in the state of New York. He is a nationally certified mental health counselor, and he has done enormous work in this area across the country, working with NCAA, working with a whole variety of organizations. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Alan Berkovitz.
I'll turn it on. Very happy to be back here. I hope that those of you who heard me before can tolerate it a second time. I think it's a good time to ask questions, or, you know, something hits you in a certain way that it didn't the first time. Don't be shy to raise your hand and ask a question. I think we're used to hearing our president say things like your president just said, which is one assault is too much. That's like something that people like to say. But what I'm really pleased is that I think you're really actually closer to making that wish come true than most places. Because as the dean just said, this is a very complicated, big place, and this is a very complicated, big issue, and to resolve it is a very complicated, big challenge. So we're not talking about something simple, and we're talking about something that we all play a role in, but I'm very pleased to see that this institution is really willing to make the long-term commitment to acknowledge the complexity and the difficulty and the multiplicity of the components, and to try and move all of that forward, because we live in a society where people look for simple solutions, and there aren't simple solutions to complicated problems. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very pleased to see what you're all doing. And it's something that is part of all of us and those we love, whether or not we know it. And I really want to echo something that was just said, to really appreciate the activists who have been trying to wake us up to this for so many decades. And, you know, it's like when you see something, then it's there, but when you don't see it, it's not there. So now we're really beginning to see the magnitude of it. And those of us who read the newspapers, which is probably most of us, are getting a really good education in perpetrator MO, right? And a lot of the dynamics, as well as the challenges to victims coming forward. So my job now is to present to you the state of the art of what we know about prevention, which is now really, we could call it a science of prevention. I don't know if the other campuses are on board yet with the technology, but I also want to compliment all of you by approaching this as a system and not only as a single institution. And if those of you who are not physically here can see and hear me now, good morning. So, as we said, this is a culture problem. So the question is, how do we change the climate? Because climates either inhibit behavior or they give permission to behavior. So you walk into an event, maybe we walk into a social event, and you kind of read the environment, and the environment gives you clues about what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is unacceptable. Now, there's certain behavior that is unacceptable that most of us would not engage in. So there's certain behavior that would be considered unacceptable that most of us would not engage in. But let's say if we had a proclivity or desire or a tendency to engage in that unacceptable behavior, then we would check out the environment and see if the environment would let us. So what we want is an environment that inhibits these behaviors that we're talking about, and we're the ones that create that environment. So that's why we want to really talk about how we understand culture and how we understand culture change. So I want to talk about what our goals are, because we want to understand the problem correctly, what we know about effective prevention, and we actually do know a lot, but because it's so complicated, most people don't actually do it. We want to talk about social norms. So for example, if you look around the room now, everyone is sitting except the people in the back, and people are dressed a certain way, and probably a lot of us are wearing shoes that we wouldn't wear in like a warm climate where we could, you know, wear sandals or something. So a norm is an acceptable behavior, but we know that the norms, or we could more correctly say the perceptions of the norms, shape how people act. Like the first time I came here, I was given a Keep Minnesota Passive Aggressive t-shirt, right? And then it said, well, maybe, maybe not, whatever you want, you know, in the bottom. So that's in a sense how you communicate is a norm, how you express discomfort. There's a norm for how you express discomfort. A lot of this is cultural. And, you know, we could joke about it, but it's very real because it shapes how we act. And in my opinion, you know, the joke we're making is based on something real, which is there's an indirect way of communicating and there's a direct way of communicating. And indirect communication can be very effective when people know how to read it. So what we want to do is create the norms that inhibit the problem. And then we really need to talk about the bystander, because now we know that for every problem, there are observers who saw something and didn't do something. So to solve this problem, we need to notice it, and then we need to know what we can do, and then we need to know how to intervene effectively. So when the problem person comes into the permissive event that they read as allowing them, let's say, to drink too much, to take one example, or to be rude, to say something that could be offensive, we're the bystanders. And we have the opportunity to respond to that behavior in a way that inhibits it, or we have an opportunity to respond to that behavior in a way that permits it. So it's really, as the Dean just said, it's an issue of collective action for which we all have to take personal responsibility. And the good news is that the bystander approach is an evolving science now, and we really know a lot about how to intervene effectively, including in an indirect Minnesota way that is effective. And so all of us need to know about that. Another thing I'll just mention, because all of you very soon will be taking an online course about this issue that you may or may not like, or that may or may not be useful. And just as a disclaimer, I helped develop that course, so I'm one of the consultants on that course. We want to think of all this as an evolving process and not as things that are fixed. So if you like something about that course, tell someone. And if you don't like something about that course, tell someone, because the technology is fluid and we can change it. And I've already heard some comments of things that can be revised from some people who have taken it. So I really encourage us all to see ourselves as partners in this process. And if we see something that doesn't feel right to us, to give the system feedback so that that can be fixed and changed. Because the effort is commendable and the idea is good, but that doesn't always mean the execution is effective. We want to talk about some case studies and lessons learned from other places, and then just I'll make some recommendations. And remember, it's fine to raise your hand and ask a question. So, we've already heard that we need to base what we're doing on research and theory and knowledge. And a lot of times with the social problem, people want to do something, so they run out and they do something, and it might not be effective. And those of us that have had children, we could use the example of DARE, which is drug education. DARE has been repeatedly shown to not be effective. The science is very robust that DARE is not effective. And so what happens is they revise DARE, and then they come up with the new and effective version, and for 2 years they can say, well, we revised it. But the point is, why do we keep doing something that doesn't work? Because we care, because we see something that really upsets us, and we want to do something, we want to feel good that we're doing something, but that obviously isn't enough if we want to solve the problem. So we need to make sure that what we're doing is going to make a difference, or at least has a good chance of making the difference. And that means it needs to be based on knowledge, which shouldn't be a radical thing to say in an educational institution or institutions. So when we talk about sexual assault and sexual harassment, to understand the problem really needs to understand the dynamics of the perpetrator, the experience of the victim, and the role of the bystander. We must see what the barriers and challenges are. So for instance, if I'm a graduate student in one of your programs and I'm being harassed by my professor or have inappropriate invitations made, the barriers are profoundly high for me to say or do anything. And we all know why. Because it's not only the next 4 years of my life, it's my whole career. So in that case, how do we reduce the barriers so at least that person will tell someone? That's the first step we want, is we want someone to tell someone and get confidential help without it triggering anything. That's one of your jobs, is to figure out how, as an institution, you can find safe, confidential places that people will easily go to tell someone something without it triggering an investigation. Because we know we have Title IX and a responsibility report, and all those things are also important, but we need to create safe ways for people to come forward. Otherwise, the rest of what needs to happen won't happen. That's only one barrier. As I said, another barrier is how I say something to the offensive person at a party. And if it's what I call Midwestern nice, how do I say it in a way that doesn't appear rude? There's all these challenges. But the point is, if we understand the barriers, we can get over them. We need to create the infrastructures, and that's where I'm really impressed with what's going on here, is you are in the process of creating those infrastructures to deliver the product. And since that's not simple, the building of the infrastructures is very complicated. And as I said, one component of that infrastructure might be requiring all of you in this room to take an online course that you may or may want to take, or that you may or may need to take, may or may not need to take. So then if we're going to do that, we don't want to just check the box. We want to do it in a way that you take something out of it. So that'll go for everything that we're doing. And as we also just heard, it's a community action effort, and it must be fluid. So it's all of our responsibility. So far, so good? So here's a paradox that some of you heard me state. We must believe every victim who reports and at the same time help ensure that all accused individuals are innocent until proven guilty. Now that's obviously a paradox because both aren't true. The word paradox is Greek, and paradox means beyond reason. Okay, so it's something that doesn't make sense. We know, and I'll talk about this later, that false accusations are very, very, very rare. So we have a moral obligation to believe every report and take it seriously as if it were true. And if you want to bet against the odds, the chances are like 95% that it is true. The chances are also that if it isn't true, the best way to find out that it isn't true is to assume that it's true. Even from an investigative point of view, if we're training investigators, the investigator talks to you and takes you seriously, and then if there is an inconsistency, it comes out. So we have a moral responsibility as an institution to believe all victims, even if it seems totally implausible. Now that we have all these public cases of very highly respected people who nobody thought would have been doing what they are now been found to have been doing, we see what courage it takes for a victim to come forward, and we see also how easy it is to disbelieve the victim. So I think we all have to make a commitment to believe all reports and treat them as if they were true, but at the same time, the accused person still has a right to be treated as innocent until proven guilty. And then if we have a good system in place, the system will get the evidence it needs and decide. But what you'll learn as you pay attention to this issue, and it's very clear now in the media, that the culture sets it up so that the perpetrator's denial is believable and the victim's report is unbelievable. So we're all in a trap. We've all been set up to come to the wrong conclusion about this. Because somebody seems like someone who wouldn't do that, and there's all these symptoms associated with the person reporting that make us less likely to believe them because they've been traumatized, because they don't remember things correctly, because their neurological system has been jolted, because they've experienced a betrayal, and because they're a person in a vulnerable situation to begin with, which is what made them exploitable. So there's all these dynamics, and we need to realize that it's a setup to believe the denial of the perpetrator and to disbelieve the accusation of the victim. So how do we reverse that, but still give someone the benefit of the doubt who's been accused? So this is called the social ecological model. It's from the CDC, and we're basically looking at all the big pieces of the puzzle from a system-wide point of view. And as was pointed out, most institutions are doing a lot of things in all of these zones. So like when I was a counseling center director, I would write these great annual reports, and I would show how my statistics went up, and we did all these great programs. And of course, I was trying to get more money out of my vice president as opposed to you getting it, right? So I would really make myself look good, make my program look good. But the problem was, even if I was individually doing great things that I could, let's say, honestly proclaim in my annual report, it might not mesh or gear with what you were doing. We might not be working towards the same goal. We might not be using the same methodology. We might not be defining the problem in the same way. So the parts don't add up. Everyone here is familiar with snow, right? In case you haven't noticed. So I grew up in central New York, so we had snow too. So I like to use the metaphor. If somebody's in the ditch and you want to push the car, you all need to push at the same moment in the same direction. And what happens is when we have all these things going on in all these, let's say, zones or domains, they're not all pushing in the same direction at the same time. So every director of every program could have a great annual report, and it doesn't produce any change. So what we really need to think about, if you're taking an online course and your students are taking a different online course, do those two online courses move you in the same direction? So that maybe if you're a faculty member, you can say something at some point in your class that will reinforce what your students learned in that course. Now you have two things that are pushing together. And then the question is, what happens after you take the course? That shouldn't be the end of it. If you're only interested in checking the box, then you can get away with only taking the course. So then your Title IX person writes a report, and we check all the boxes, and your athletic department checks all their boxes because they're accountable to the NCAA, and we're all okay, and the lawyers are fine because we're not in danger of a lawsuit, and we haven't solved anything. Now, I'm in favor of compliance. Right? We want to be compliant, even if I'm not always a compliant person. But it's not enough. So we need to think at all these different domains and think of all the things we're doing, how they fit together. And I'll refer back to this later, but I'll give you one example. We know that scare tactics don't work. We know that giving people information doesn't work. And we know that we need to have policies. So if we talk about our policies from the point of view of, I'm going to scare you so that you don't get in trouble and you behave, that's not effective. If we talk about our policies from the point of view of, most of the members of this community are good, caring people who want to do the right thing and aren't going to get in trouble, but if you do X, Y, and Z, here's what the consequences are. It's a different way of framing the idea of a policy. I'm not treating all of you as you're going to do something illegal when you leave this room, so I need to scare you out of doing that. I'm treating all of you as who you are. But we still have the policy for the person who doesn't. So then when we talk about the individual bystander, we acknowledge that most people care and want to do the right thing, but they need the skills and the understanding. So as we go through all these zones, we talk about things in mutually consistent ways that are evidence-based. And then when I move into one of your residence halls, The resident advisor talks to me about the policies in the same way that most of you don't need to hear this, but we want to create a community in which people care about and respect each other. So here's some of the norms, et cetera, et cetera. So you see what I'm saying? That's where it has to all fit together, and that's where it doesn't all fit together in most places. And then I had my great annual report, right, that was competing with your great annual report, as opposed to all of us trying to do something that pushed the car out of the ditch. So it's what we do, it's how we do it, and it's how we put that all together in a comprehensive long-term plan, which is now what we're trying to do here and on the other state campuses. And so I like the words that it's consistent and synergistic across programs and departments. So we have policies and procedures, as I said, which we need to have. But going to the sexual assault or perpetrator of sexual assault or sexual harassment, we hope this is going to change. But if you want to commit a crime, it's actually one of the safest ones you can commit. There's the least chance of anything happening. First, the person has to report you. Then there has to be enough evidence to take the report to the next step. Right, then you have to have, if you're going to court, then you have to have a lawyer, an advocate that's going to prosecute your case effectively. Then you have to have a jury that's going to believe you. There's so many steps where we lose so many people that there are very few consequences of perpetrating a sexual assault for most perpetrators. So telling them they're going to get in trouble isn't going to, I mean, look at the news, right? We have people that have been doing this for 20 or 30 years who are just getting busted now. So scaring people about policies or consequences is not a disincentive, unfortunately, but we still need to have them and we need to present them. And they need to be implemented. If, like if you take a different example of the speed limit, right? My personal guideline, which some of you have heard, is up to 9 miles over the speed limit. Because I know that the troopers give you a little gray zone. So the speed limit is changing my behavior because I don't want to get a ticket, I don't want my insurance to go up, I don't want to get points on my license, and I know there's a very good chance that that will happen if I go 15 miles over the speed limit. So policies only work when there's consequences. And we can create an environment here in the University of Minnesota system where there are consequences. And then the policy begins to work. We need services for victims, and we cannot emphasize this enough. Not only as, let's say, a moral obligation of the institution to people who have been hurt and need to heal from that hurt, but because the best way to bust perpetrators is for victims to come forward, because most perpetrators are multiple perpetrators. So if I'm on the faculty and something is motivating me to cross boundaries with my graduate students, I'm going to have a new cohort of graduate students, right, every 4 or 5 years, and whatever that is inside of me that is leading me to do that will repeat itself. So I'll have a generation of graduate students who have been subjected to my inappropriate behavior. So we really need, as I said, to lower the bar to people coming forward. And we say that prevention is primarily men's responsibility because the majority of assaults are perpetrated by males on females. And the research shows that men who perpetrate are what we call hypermasculine. They take all of society's messages about how to be a man very seriously. And the biggest influence on their behavior is other men. So we're not excluding same-sex assaults, we're not excluding female on male assaults, but we're acknowledging that the majority of assaults are male on female and that the majority of assaults are perpetrated by men who are more likely to be influenced by other men than by women. And if sexism didn't exist, we wouldn't have this problem, or we wouldn't have this problem in this way. So we need to acknowledge that as, let's say, a gendered. The United Nations uses the term gender-based violence. So when we talk about women's role, we use a different terminology and we talk about risk reduction or rape avoidance, where there are programs where you can teach a vulnerable individual what are the warning signs of a dangerous situation, how to handle that situation, what is the MO of the perpetrator. And risk reduction programs have been shown by the research to reduce the number of assaults in the group that receives the program. And when we talk about vulnerability, we're not only talking about gender as a vulnerability, but all the other vulnerabilities based on race, class, immigration status, sexual orientation. So the research is very clear that individuals in more vulnerable groups have much, much higher rates of assault. So let's say we want to do a risk reduction program for all of your students, and we choose one of the ones that has been tested and shown to make a difference. And I'm a perpetrator. So my fellow students, if I'm interested in females, what doesn't matter who I'm interested in? Whoever I'm interested in. If that person has been taught to repel me, it doesn't mean I won't succeed, but it's harder. So I'll go somewhere else. I'll go home on the weekend and go out with my friends from high school. In other words, risk reduction is not really prevention, because the perpetrator goes somewhere else. But as a community, you may decide that you have a responsibility to reduce the risk, just like when you take a driving course and you get points off your license and they tell you all the things they tell you. It's still a tool that we want to consider, but we don't want to call it prevention. So when I use the word prevention, I'm primarily referring to the role of men in preventing the violence of other men. And the research is even clear that the majority of violence of women in long-term same-sex relationships, the violence that they experience, also the majority that comes from men. So we live in a society where, independently of sexual orientation, most sexual harassment and most sexual assault is committed by male-identified individuals, even though that's not 100%, and we have to consider the gendered nature of the issue in order to solve it. Does that work for everyone? So you don't have to read this, but this is University of Albany, SUNY Albany, New York, which is a big state institution like here. It's also the flagship institution in New York State. And they're basically saying, we were doing this for 8 years and nothing was happening. And all of a sudden, after 8 years, everything started getting better. Like all of our measures declined at the same time. So I like this quote because it lets us know that we're not going to have a quick fix. There isn't a simple solution. But if we do all the right things consistently over time, at some point we'll reach that tipping point where it flips. So do we want to focus on potential victims? Yes, but not exclusively. Do we want to focus on the minority of assault? Yes, but it turns out that their behavior is very hard to change because it's really characterological, or you could say pathological. On the other hand, even the more sick person who commits hundreds of assaults over a period of decades doesn't want to get busted. Yes?
5%. You could explain that?
Yes, I'll get to it, but since I like to take the question when it comes up because then it's alive. So the 5% is this, that 5% of men commit 95% of the assaults. Okay? So let's take the news that's coming out of Hollywood, right? We now have a lot of publicly identified serial perpetrators, men who re-perpetrate over and over. So the majority of victims are created by those few men. But it doesn't mean that you or I maybe didn't harass 1 or 2 people in the last 10 years. So we account for the other 5%. But the overwhelming majority are perpetrated by a small percentage of men who perpetrate the majority of assaults. So if we're not really going to change their behavior. The only thing that might change their behavior is if they're really, really afraid of getting busted. Go ahead. But we don't know the answer to that. We just know that, in general, 5% of men commit 95% of the assaults. But if you think it through, that means the overwhelming majority of other men are bystanders. right? So once again, if you read the papers, you see that all the warning signs were overlooked over a period of years. And if the bystanders had been trained to not overlook the warning signs and had ways of responding that they weren't too afraid to try, then we would have busted some of these people a long time ago. Does that answer your question? I much, much prefer to take the question when it comes up because there's like a flow and it's organic. So it doesn't matter if there's a slide in 10 slides now that says what I just said, then we'll just go through that slide really quick. So everyone, please raise your hand anytime. So the majority who are bystanders is now considered to be the most powerful way of intervening because the 5% live among the 95%, and the same also for victims, right? All of us are bystanders to the victims. I'll tell you a personal story. I have two sisters. So because I do this work, I was working in a part of the country where my sisters live, and we went out to lunch, and because of my sisters knowing that I do this work, one of my sisters felt safe to make a disclosure to me about an assault in high school. So my first reaction was, why didn't you tell me? You know, like I became upset at her that she didn't tell me. I'm her older brother, blah, 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 but I knew better than to say that. But I thought that, right? So I didn't say that. So then I started asking myself a different question. What could I have done in the last 30 years that she would have wanted to tell me? That's the right question. If you're on the faculty, what do you need to do so that if I'm in your department and I'm harassing someone, that graduate student or student will feel safe coming to you? Now then, of course, it becomes more complicated because if they tell you, then you have to report it. So you also have to be trained to say, if you want to tell me something like this and this, I would have to do this. But if that happened to you, I really want to make sure that, you know, University of Minnesota gives you what you need. So I could also have you talk to this person who's completely confidential and know what would happen. In other words, now it's a little more complicated for someone to disclose. But we still want people to go somewhere and tell someone, and we want to be the people who are inviting them to do that. And right, this isn't only about sexual assault. This is about racism if you're white, or homophobia if you're straight, or you know, any issue where someone's in a vulnerable group. We have responsibility to be a positive ally for that person that they would want to seek us out.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, right. So personally, I don't like the situation that you've been put in, and I don't feel it's a good idea. It's well motivated, right? I would personally frame it as a societal overreaction based on the recognition of a problem that we have been in denial about. But if you're my advisor and I have a good relationship with you, we want me to come to you. So now you're in this delicate position where you have to stop the person before they tell you and then give them their other options. But then we have responsibility as an institution to create those other options. So let me give you an example of what the military is doing. The military is really struggling with this. And there's one piece of the puzzle that they're doing great. They have two kinds of reports, restricted and unrestricted. If you make an unrestricted report, which is I tell you and you're my advisor and now you have to report it, I lose control. Unless I wanted you to do that. If you make a restricted report, you're talking to a person who has legal confidentiality who doesn't have to tell anyone. So we want to create throughout the institution places where people can make restricted reports and not have any consequences except that they get the help they need. And we need to create that so you stop me before I say too much and you say, you know, if you want to disclose something to me that happened to you personally, I would have to do something, but if you talk to so-and-so, they don't have to do anything. And then we have to figure out from a legal point of view how to create that safety. Like maybe if you had a lot of people go through the Rape Crisis Center training in the Twin Cities, I don't know, this is a hypothesis. Maybe going through that training would make them confidential reporters. We don't know what it is, but you have a responsibility to figure that out, so that you shunt me off to someone who's confidential. Now, what's happening in the military, which is very good, is that after people make restricted reports, they say a lot of them flip. Because after you get help and you have someone to talk to and you have a chance to just get your feet back on the ground, and maybe you get some special accommodations, like you don't have to go to classes with that person or whatever, then you want to do something about it. So in the end, we have more cases going into the system and more accusations being filed, but we have a system that first gives people the help that they need. So did that answer your question? But the only thing I could say, which doesn't help you, is I'm glad I'm not in your position as a faculty member, because it's a very dicey situation that you're in now. And as I said, I personally believe it's due to an overreaction that's well intended, but that's the reality we're in, so now we have to negotiate inside of that reality. Thank you for clarifying that. Now, another point is that, and this is a question for your lawyers, you have the opportunity to decide how you want to interpret the law, as long as it's an acceptable interpretation. And some institutions have decided that as long as a faculty member refers the student to someone who's confidential, then you have fulfilled your reporting function. So that would be a better solution from my personal point of view.
Can you say that again?
If I come to you and tell you that one of your colleagues is harassing me, and you make sure that I go to the Aurora Center and I talk to someone, then it's possible that the lawyers for the University of Minnesota system could decide that that was fulfilling your mandated reporting obligation, and I don't have to talk to someone who then has to explain to me what Dean Finnegan said, that, here's all your options and blah, blah, blah. So to me, that's a better angle on that.
So I want to pin you down on this a little bit.
Okay, see if you can. I know already that you would be able to.
Are you ready?
Part of your answer? Yeah, so the question is, would I recommend that all of you try and change the policy that you're now subjected to so that there wasn't a deterrent to reporting? So I would say I don't know the answer, because it's a question of what's effective use of your resources and time. The important thing is that victims have a safe place they can go to get the help they need and explore their options. And if you, meaning the University of Minnesota system, can interpret this policy in such a way that I still feel comfortable coming to you if you're a member of my department, and you still feel comfortable handling it so that I don't get put into another situation where I have to decide if I want to take legal action, I think you have to figure out how to negotiate this, and you may or may not want to put your efforts into trying to change the policy, or you may want to over the long run. But the most important thing is that we lower the barriers for victims to report, and that they get the help that they need, and that then they are in a position to decide how they want to go forward or not. And that could even include, by the way, let's just go work the faculty example more, partly because that's who's, more who this audience is. If I report a particular person, there's a value in the system keeping that information. Because in 2 years, some other person might report the same person. So then we want the system to be able to say, Alan, if somebody else reported the same person, would you be willing to go forward if there was also another person who was willing to go forward? And then we go back to that other person and say, would you be willing, it's a little bit of a dance how you do it, and then both say yes. So then you say, would you be willing to, and then you go another step where now you have two people who have the same, because we also know with these cases that the perpetrator has the same MO. So we have two similar cases. So we really want to create a system that busts people. And there's many ways to do that. And I might make a report and not want it to go any further at that moment in my life. But if the report information is used in an intelligent way, it could make it possible to go forward at another point where in the past we wouldn't have either. So let me repeat that first, just for the mic. So the comment from someone who's more knowledgeable than me is that the system is designed to give anyone who reports knowledge about all the available options that they have to them. Well, I'm glad to hear that. So let me repeat that. So the way the information is handled here is that the complainant is given all their options and all the resources, including the legal and investigative resources, but nothing is done unless they agree to go forward. So let's just take it a step further. I don't think it's off track. So let's say I'm a faculty member, and my advisee or student tells me, what is my responsibility to tell them, or do I have a responsibility to tell you, or how does that piece of the puzzle work here? Okay, so let's redo my talk, right? Because I have to change the tone now, because this institution is doing it in a way that I'm personally much more comfortable with. Because once again, you're interpreting the law. So I would say as a faculty member, if you tell me I'm required to tell the Title IX office, but that is only so that you can talk to someone who knows all the resources and options that you need, and that you can decide what's best for you to do in this moment, and nothing will happen unless you want it to. But you will be getting a letter or an invitation to talk to them, and I have responsibility to tell them about this conversation. That would be more accurate for this institution.
Yeah, and
Or the system. I don't know if this is for the University of Minnesota system, not only this campus.
I could say it's the same for Duluth.
Okay, so that's good for everyone to know. But there still is a mandatory reporting trigger, but it's more interpreted as a responsibility to provide support and not as responsibility to investigate, whereas in some places it is interpreted as a responsibility to investigate. So, by the way, this is why we need a lot of training, which I obviously don't have for this campus or this system, right? This is why we need a lot of training, so that we all know what to do when X happens. Because we want to invite X, right? We don't want you to be afraid to have a student to tell you something. We want you to be really thinking about how to make it so that a student would tell you something. And then we need to know how to handle it so that it works for everyone, including hopefully someone gets busted. Or if there's a danger of imminent harm, then the institution has a different responsibility.
But that's not,
Okay, so let me propose this one more comment, and then we'll say this conversation has identified a training need, which is everyone's training need, which is part of our comprehensive response, needs to have everyone trained so that they understand their role and the constraints and options within their role, and that we create an environment where we maximize people's comfortableness reporting something to someone when something happens. And that might differ by your position in the institution, et cetera, and it might differ for someone who works at a different institution or a different system, but that's part of the comprehensive effort that we're undertaking, is to create that environment where victims feel safe reporting and the people they're reporting to know how to handle being in that position, as opposed to not wanting to be in that position. So one more comment. Right, so let me repeat the comment. So there's a comment from a student who is in a role where she works with students who might come forward, and while there are benefits to the system and it can work well, people in marginalized groups who might have a historical mistrust or mistreatment by the system are less willing to use the system. So the question becomes, how do we address that? And I'm not trying to cop out, but that's your responsibility. In other words, it's your responsibility as a community to create safe spaces for all to report. And how that looks will be different according to the community that we're talking about, because each community is a community with a different culture, with different values, with different understanding about sexual expression, et cetera, maybe with different language issues. So the point is, it's the University of Minnesota's system responsibility to make it safe for anyone to report. And how that works will have to differ. You can't have one size fits all, because when you have one size fits all, you just reproduce oppression, because you're just doing it according to the way it was always done by the group that was doing it. So that's a question I have to throw back to all of you, that's part of your ongoing work to make sure that happens, and to listen to those individuals, such as the speaker now, who has information about whether or not people feel safe accessing the system. Because we want the system to be accessed by everyone. And remember, if I'm a perpetrator, I will look for the most vulnerable person. So if you create a system that's safe for 90% to access and use and get me busted, I'll perp the 10%. Read the newspapers. We're talking about really smart people. So it's our responsibility to make it possible for everyone to report and to take in consideration the barriers for those individuals to report that are part of their life experience and their identity and the intersectionality of their identities, et cetera, et cetera. So, this is part of what you have to figure out as you go forward, but at least we're talking about it in the beginning so that you're aware that this is part of what you have to figure out as you go forward. Because also, let's say in a department or in a residence hall or in any environment, certain individuals will feel safer talking to other certain individuals. I mean, we all want to think we're really nice and everyone will talk to us, but that's not true. So we need to make it accessible for everyone to talk to someone. As I said, in the end, that's the best way to bust perps, right, is to have more people report. So these are all, I don't consider this a sidetrack, but now we'll keep going forward on the prevention piece because this is really like a critical issue for this community to address. And I'm glad that your Title IX office and your system is addressing it in a way that I would consider more victim-informed and more trauma-informed, and that you feel legally you can do that. So that's better for all of you in the room. But the issue itself is still very complex, and we still realize that certain groups within our community still do not feel that the system is safe for them, and it's our responsibility to fix that. So here it goes back to the point that 5% of men, I was reading articles on the plane, right? I have this whole file in my computer of articles I haven't had time to look at. So I looked at one article yesterday and it said men who previously perpetrated have a 5 times greater chance of perpetrating in the next year. So it's like there's a lot of research that this is very robust. And of course, as I said, if you read the newspapers, you have plenty of good examples. Now, it isn't that all men are angels, right? We've all been taught to feel superior to women, and we've all have conscious or unconscious sexism. And, in the communication area, 95% of the interruptions in a conversation between a male and a female are, the man interrupting the woman. My wife is always telling me, like, I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to listen to me, but I always want to do something. So it's not that we're all angels. We're all contaminated by the way we've been taught to be in our bodies, but in terms of actual, let's say, illegal behavior, the most illegal behavior is 5% committed, 95%, and there are other forms of coercive behavior that 20 or more, and it's because studies use different methodologies, so we can't give like an exact number. And that most men are not assaultive, and they're the ones who need to bust the ones who are. That's really the prevention piece. And previous victims, women and or marginalized groups. So for instance, trans, people who identify as trans have like rates that are off the charts compared to other groups. Poverty, right? Poverty makes you vulnerable. Anything that makes someone vulnerable, such as being a graduate student, right? Or many other examples, such as being an employee. Anything that makes someone vulnerable puts them more at risk. And the more vulnerabilities an individual has, like if I'm a perp and I go into a bar and I'm kind of sizing up the environment, an undocumented immigrant would be a great choice. I mean, it sounds cruel, but it is cruel, right? It's very creepy when you think about it. So we need to understand how it works. So we want to teach people to reduce their risk without blaming them if something happens. That's a big Achilles heel of risk reduction, is you don't want people to feel, oh, I went to that workshop, they told me all these things, I didn't do it, it was my fault. What the research shows is that if it's done correctly, victims are less likely to blame themselves and have a more healthy recovery. So effective risk reduction does not result in self-blame when something happens. And these are some of the components, and it turns out the research shows that self-defense is a very important component of effective risk reduction or rape avoidance. Now, I know of one campus that is also trying to respond to this issue, and they have decided that their first step is going to bring in one of the more respected, well-researched risk reduction programs and give it to all their women students, and they're not doing anything for men yet, and I don't like that, because that's putting the responsibility on women. And it's making it seem like women can solve the problem, and it's not holding men accountable for solving the problem. So I don't personally think that was a good institutional response for that institution. They should announce something for both genders, or all gender identities at the same time. It's a great question. So so the question is, do we have responsibility to teach people from vulnerable identities, such as people with physical disabilities, who have not been taught to advocate for themselves, self-advocacy around sexuality? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, so, I think that we need to teach everyone self-advocacy around how they express their sexuality, right? That's for all of us. But certain groups who are more vulnerable, or who have other people take over their responsibility for them, or they're even seen as not sexual, it's more complicated. But I think that from a healthy sexuality point of view, we want to teach everyone self-advocacy, to be able to say, what do I want, and how do I get it, if I could put it that way, and what don't I want, and maybe I'm not even sure, so how do I handle that? That should be for everyone. And just to use an example, the abstinence-based sexual education programs do not work. And the reason they don't work, because it's a slippery slope. It's all or nothing. So there's none of this self-advocacy. There's none of the ability to say, well, I want this, but I don't want this, and how do I negotiate this? So if you tell people just don't ever do it, they don't have any skills. So we want to have a healthy community where everyone is able to, let's say, advocate for themselves about what they want in relation to physical intimacy, and not prejudice any group from being able to do that. But also, I personally try and be very careful about the language around disability, because I think we're all disabled, and some people have visible disabilities. So to the extent that we're not able to advocate for ourselves, what is the institution's responsibility to support that person until they're in a position to be more able to advocate for themselves? That's another. Now, this may fall under the domain of teaching people about healthy sexuality, as well as under the domain of preventing violence. And then you as an institution have to decide. Because, for instance, you can have consenting sex that doesn't feel good afterwards. That's called regretted sex. So I could agree to something and then the next day feel that I made a mistake. And if I wasn't coerced into doing it, it was a consenting thing. So maybe the University of Minnesota system wants me also to have the self-advocacy skills to feel good about my consenting sexual experiences, and not only focus on non-consenting. That's kind of part of your charge, to figure out how to manage talking about all of that. Great questions. So we need to understand perpetrator motivations and create an inhibiting environment. And the most important thing, I think, is to encourage bystanders to intervene, which means to reduce the barriers and teach intervention skills. And I'll talk a little bit about at the end, and strengthen norms that inhibit violence. So it's like all of the above. We always focus on the positive. So we can teach people how to respond to risk situations. We can teach people consent. The way most institutions teach consent is not going to prevent sexual assault, even though it's good to have people learn how to have consent, because most people already have consent. So the way to teach consent is to teach people also to notice when someone else doesn't have consent and to step in. But you can walk around campuses and they have all these consent is sexy tables and t-shirts and everything, and that's okay from the point of view of fostering self-advocacy and healthy sexuality, but it's not a good sexual assault prevention strategy. So it's how you teach about consent. And going back now to the situation where there's a power differential, I may quote consent to be in a situation that I don't want to be because someone has more power than me, but then that's not consent. Engaging the bystander is obviously what I'm promoting, and correcting misperceived norms, because we talk about the norms are misperceived, which means I don't know that you're also upset. So because I don't know that you're also upset, I don't tell you that it upsets me when my colleague does X. And the men who perpetrate don't know that their friends don't like what they're doing. There's really good research out that even they don't know that their best friends don't agree with them. So when the norms are healthy, but they're unknown, they're depotentiated. But when the norms are healthy and they're known, they're inhibiting. So we want to identify what the norms are, what are the healthy norms, what are the misperceived norms, and we want to educate people that this is a very healthy community and we don't accept X, Y, and Z. And if you do X, Y, or Z, someone's going to say something to you. And the person who says something to you is going to know that other people agree with them and are going to back them up when I put that person down. Because if you think about hypermasculine behavior, right? If you think about the mentality of a hypermasculine man, if I'm engaging as a hypermasculine man in offensive behavior and another man challenges me, I'm going to question his sexuality. I'm going to say, well, you're just jealous. You're not getting any. What's your problem? Are you gay? So I have a bully mentality and I smash anyone down who challenges me, and then everyone's afraid to challenge me. But instead what we need is everyone knows that they're all willing to challenge me, and then, so I say, what's your problem? You're not getting any? And someone else says, no, Alan, I agree with him. I'm not interested in hearing about this. And someone goes, yeah. And all of a sudden I look around and I realize I don't have an audience. So now I'm going to shut up. But as long as I can bully one of you into silence, everyone will be in silence. So knowing the true norm, and I'm sure a lot of the male-identified people in the room can relate to this, being in many, many situations where you were really uncomfortable and you didn't know that the other men were also uncomfortable. So that's part of prevention, is letting each other know that we don't like it and we want to do something about it. So we want to do all of the above: support victim recovery, engage bystanders, and inhibit perpetrators. So as we said, it's not any one thing you do, it's how you put it all together. And that's why I'm really excited to be here. And you know, because I had this reputation, you know, people reach out to me. Like someone once said to me, you're the go-to person. Most institutions don't follow up with me because I'm too complicated. I'm not selling anything, right? I'm not rich. Like, I haven't made a lot of money. I have a good life, I'm not complaining. But I haven't made a lot of money from my reputation because I'm not selling anything. I don't have a program, I don't have an app, I don't have a quick fix because I don't believe in quick fixes. So if I could convince people that I had a quick fix, I would be richer, but I couldn't live with myself. So I'd rather be here with you and have no one else call me back. Because it's complicated. Okay, so we need to understand false accusations, which is that they're very, very rare and they almost never happen. We need to understand victim trauma and victim blaming, because when someone is disorganized and traumatized, then all these things happen that make them appear unreliable, that we don't believe their report. And then in addition to that, if we have unconscious prejudices about individuals from that group, we treat them as more unbelievable. But think of how pernicious it is, because if I perp the person who's most vulnerable, they'll be the person that you have the most stereotypes who you're less likely to believe. So let's take the military. I do a lot of work with the military. Let's say there's someone in my unit who is driving me crazy, and I would be happy if that person was gone. That person is a pain in the butt. And now that person claims that they were sexually assaulted. I'm predisposed to not believing them. But that's the best person for someone in my unit to take advantage of. So we have to really understand the dynamics. And the perpetrator methodology, and that prevention is everyone's responsibility. And we need to always remember that most people want to do the right thing. So ask yourself this question. I won't ask you to raise your hands. Do you know someone who's had an unwanted experience? Usually a majority of people will raise their hand, and the majority will keep their hands up if I say, do you believe this person? In really large audiences, which I don't like to be in front of, I've learned this is really good, because I say, look around. Everyone see how many people have their hand up that they believe this person. So why are we skeptical when it's someone we don't know? So, as I said, the biggest predictor from a scientific point of view of perpetrating is what we call hypermasculinity. And men, hypermasculine men, commit most of the assaults, including women in same-sex relationships and sexual minorities. They're identified by men. They're committed by men who identify as heterosexuals. So even though we might also want to or be willing to question sexual identities and think of gender as more fluid or all these other discussions that we're having, we need to make room for those discussions. We also need to say, even if you believe in gender fluidity or you don't believe in gender, the person who's going to perpetrate you believes in his gender. So we can't not talk about gender. Because the person who's most likely to perpetrate overdoes his adherence to what we would call traditional masculine norms. So as I said, they seek out vulnerable individuals and they increase their vulnerability. So if a perp goes into a bar and he's looking to perp a woman, but it could be a man perping a man, he'll get in your space and he'll see how you push him out of your space. And then he'll bounce around until he finds someone who doesn't push him out of his space. So they're very skilled at either finding vulnerable individuals or creating vulnerable situations, right? Such as being alone in a hotel room with someone for a job interview or something. They're almost always repeat offenders. They may be respected. They make the victim look less believable and the perpetrator more believable. They care more about what men think than women think, which is why men need to intervene with them. And as I said, serial predators. So this was referred to earlier. Alcohol increases the risk of assault, but it doesn't cause assault. And the research shows that the numbers of assaults would be the same even if we didn't have alcohol. So if I want to increase your vulnerability, alcohol is a good weapon. But if I don't have that weapon, I'll do it in some other way. So it's very complicated because we have a tendency of talking about alcohol in a way that allows us to blame the victim for putting themselves in that situation. Now, of course, the University of Minnesota system also has a moral responsibility that if I have a drinking problem and I keep putting myself in vulnerable situations, you have responsibility to intervene with me and get me help for my drinking problem. But not to say that I'm at fault for what happened to me because I put myself at risk. They engage in they're from all racial groups, so we tend to have stereotypes about what perpetrators look like, and they look like everyone who's male. Right? They're not more one color or one group or anything. And here's the important point. Most men don't know that other men are uncomfortable. But the misperception is the highest in the perpetrator group for any misbehavior. Right? Gamblers think that everyone gambles, and domestic violence perpetrators think that everyone hits their wife if she gives him lip or whatever you want to say. That in their mindset, they can justify their behavior to themselves because they think it's more normal than it really is. So our job as a community is to let them know that it's not normal and we don't accept it and other people don't agree with you. So they look for someone who's vulnerable and they groom that person, and they intentionally increase that person's vulnerability, and they isolate that person, right? So now we know one of the recent cases with a medical doctor, right? A woman receiving an exam on a table in a doctor's office is a vulnerable position. So that's a one-time vulnerable relationship, but it's designed to be vulnerable. So a perpetrator exploits that. Whereas another person grooms the victim over a longer period of time, like we saw at Penn State with Jerry Sandusky, right, where he actually creates a nonprofit foundation for young boys who don't have a father that will look at him as a father figure. So the grooming process can be over time or situational, but in any case, the perpetrator creates a vulnerable situation for him or, in some cases, her to perpetrate. So how do we inhibit perpetrators? First of all, they need to know that other people don't think it's okay. So if I'm bragging about, this is one of my teenage uncomfortable situations, right? Listening to someone brag about his sexual exploits and not wanting to hear it. Well, if it were a cartoon, you would look around the cartoon and most of the guys would be thinking, I don't really want to hear this, like, this is none of my business. And then the bubble would also say, but no one else seems to mind, or the other guys seem to be into it. And then the guy who's telling his exploits, real or imagined, is doing so because he thinks that's giving him credibility with the other guys. So we need to break that scenario by letting the truth be known that most men don't want to hear it and are not interested. Or, you know, whatever is the case. If we're on a search committee, right, and we're looking at CVs and we're considering inviting a female to campus, and I say, well, I think we've paid enough attention to this affirmative action stuff because the last two females candidates we hired were females. What are you going to say? You have to decide. You might say, well, the last two hires we did were the best hires we did in 20 years, so let's go for another. You know, you have to figure out what you could say in that moment that would work, that would still let that person know that you weren't okay with what they said. By the way, that's a very good bystander intervention technique that's very Minnesota nice, which I call indirect intervention, which is for everyone, which is when someone makes a stereotypical remark about a group, you make a positive remark. Someone says, oh, the university says hiring all these women for affirmative action, and you say, well, my best 3 professors in my 4 years here were women. You have to say something that's true. But since I believe women are equally competent to men, I don't have any problem saying good things about women or, you know, whatever group. So I think of something that I could say that contradicts that remark. And then I don't let the remark float. Okay, so someone had an aha moment who's actually very smart, although he's describing himself as not. And the aha moment was that the bystander isn't only present at the event, the bystander is present in the environment. And so remember, if the environment is inhibiting or disinhibiting, in the disinhibiting environment, men make offensive comments about women or other groups. Group A makes an offensive comment about Group B. So if I hear that remark and I don't say anything, I'm reproducing the disinhibiting environment. But if I say something, I create an inhibiting environment. So I'll give you an example. There was a really nice article in the New York Times, an opinion a year or two ago, about a guy who works on Wall Street and all the sexism that he hears and he doesn't know what to do. And it's interesting because I actually wrote an article a few months ago using his remarks about all the responses he could have made, and I couldn't get it published. I couldn't get it into any of the major newspapers. It's like they're really not interested in prevention. But one example was that his supervisor at dinner made a comment, a sexualized comment about the waitress. And so one of the things he could have said, well, I'm really hungry, I just hope she'll give us good service. Or I've been here before, she's a great server. In other words, you can shift the discussion, and now maybe that person is more likely to perp, and you're not going to be in the room when they perp, but you're part of the permissive environment that makes him think he can objectify and over-sexualize women, and that that's a thing that most men like. Because if he thinks that that's a thing that most men like, it's all the other men who have to let him know that we don't. Now, I'm not going to say he will never perp, but it will bust his mindset that makes it easier for him to perp. So that's a very important comment. It's all the behavior takes place on a continuum, and we're bystanders to any behavior that isn't healthy, even if we're not bystanders to the most extreme of the unhealthy behaviors. And also, other bystanders don't intervene when they don't know that other bystanders are also don't like that remark. So we need to teach people to actively intervene. And then I put in parentheses risk reduction because I'm not considering that prevention, but I think that's still, I mean, if you read also the Hollywood, you know, the actresses get more attention. So if you read the actress stories, some of them tell, well, so-and-so made the moves on me, but I was able to push him away. And as a culture, we haven't really zeroed in on that and said, well, who were the individuals that were successful in repelling the attempt, and what skills did they use, and could we teach those skills to other people? That's called risk reduction. It's still not enough because the event should have never happened to begin with, and it's still traumatizing for that person. So we're not justifying anything, we're just acknowledging, or in the more mutual area of giving and receiving sexual consent, we could use the word self-advocacy, right? But it's the same thing. We want people to be empowered to be able to respond effectively. So a norm is an acceptability of a belief, and we know from a lot of research that people misperceive the norm, that people think people drink more than they really do, people think people are sexually active more than they really are, people think that other people are more comfortable with offensive remarks. It applies to everything almost, it turns out, because we're making judgments, right? We're making guesses about other people, and your feelings are internal and I don't see them. So I have to assume that you didn't mind that remark when actually you did mind that remark. And so with respect to sexual harassment and sexual assault, there are a lot of misperceptions that perpetuate the problem, which is why the bystander is not only the bystander to the event, the bystander is a bystander to the events that lead up to the event. So we have a lot of research on this. I'm not going to go through this now for the sake of time, but the point is there's tons of social science research documenting the way people over or underestimate healthy or unhealthy behavior in their environment. And to put it simply, when the majority thinks it's a minority, we call that pluralistic ignorance, and when the minority thinks it's a majority, we call that false consensus. So let's say I cheated on an exam and I'm bragging about it, and most students in my class don't like that, but they think that other people don't mind, then they don't say anything to me. Yes, so when I was here last time, one of the exciting ideas was to have a research consortium of faculty. One of the unexplored research questions is the role of misperceptions on victim behavior. But for instance, there's one interesting study that shows that heterosexual female college students overestimate heterosexual male college students' desire to hook up. So women feel pressure to, quote, hook up, and there are certainly environments in which there is pressure to hook up, but if the women are interested in men and they overestimate the guy's desire to hook up, that would be a misperception that would have consequences. So I believe there are huge misperceptions. For instance, I think most victims blame themselves but don't blame other victims. So we could, even in a support group for victims, we could hand a little survey and say, now that we've had our fourth meeting and all of you have heard each other's stories, to what extent do you believe the stories of the other women in the group and not blame them for what happened to them? And then we say, to what extent do you blame yourself for what happened to you? And I predict most people would still blame themselves but not blame the others. So that would be a very effective therapeutic intervention, because you could say, well, you've all had this happen and you've all heard each other's stories. Why do you not blame each other but you're still blaming yourself? So that's a great question that we don't know the answer to, but I think I have thoughts about what we would find out. So you can see how when the majority thinks it's a minority, the majority is silent, and when the minority thinks it's a majority, the minority is outspoken. So we know that misperceptions inhibit men from intervening, and that increase the likelihood that perpetrators will assault. And I'm not, if you give me more time, I'll cite all the studies, but I'm not citing all the studies now. But each of these bullets is like 5 studies or 20 studies, or I'm giving you the conclusions of the research. So here, just to give an example, right? We asked men, do you agree or disagree? It is only women who dress suggestively that are raped. So 79% of men disagree. But only 44% of men think that most men disagree. Right? So the majority is healthy, but the majority thinks that the majority is unhealthy. So imagine now I'm sitting with a bunch of guys, and one of my friends says, well, look at how she was dressed. What did she expect? And no one says anything, even though most people don't like it, because most people don't know that most people don't like it. So this is one where Planned Parenthood of New York was trying to address unwanted pregnancies in a middle school, right? I don't think anyone in middle school should be having sex. But they asked the girls, by the end of 8th grade, how many girls do you think have had sexual intercourse? And over half the orange thought that half or more had had sex. Is that clear? When in fact, only 22% had had sex. Now, I always cringe when I say only, because that's too much from my point of view, but relative to what people thought. Now, here's the interesting thing. The 8% who thought that almost all had sex were 10 times more likely to have sex. So the misperception is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. I act on the assumption that's not correct, and then it leads to consequences. So that's why misperception correction is a huge part of any culture change, because we're all walking around not knowing the truth about each other. Even in like a small town, of which you have a lot, right? You have a lot of small rural communities in Minnesota where we know everything about each other, but we still don't know a lot of other things about each other that are really important, such as people don't like Alan Berkovitz's offensive remarks. So they made this poster. They couldn't make a poster that said only 22% of middle school girls had sex, right? So they also asked the students, when do you think it's okay for two people to have sex? Kids your age, kids in high school, two adults who are serious, two adults who are married. And the kids said the only people who should be having sexual intercourse are adults in a serious relationship, whether married or not. So they made this poster. Think again, the truth is, most kids think sex is for adults. So I think this is a really important part of your efforts, and the task force is going to have me do a training on this methodology Thursday. So that it's really a tool that you have to foster the health of the community. But we know that media campaigns by themselves are not effective. It's in conjunction with other efforts that are mutually reinforcing. This is the same thing about harassment. Most kids don't like it, but most kids think that other kids either don't mind or think it's funny. See the difference? How do you think most kids in your grade feel when they hear another kid making sexual comments? Okay, 34% think that most kids think it's funny or don't care, 38%, when in fact 66% want it to stop. So one of the best, and I would say easiest, it's not really easy, but relative to like changing somebody's upbringing or changing their family environment, or if they're at risk for alcoholism, changing their genetics, it's much easier to tell people the truth about other people if you can do it in a way that they would believe you, which is easier said than done.
I think those numbers have changed. I noticed it says 2002.
I don't know if the numbers that change, and it would be very specific to like the school, you know, so I don't know the answer to that. But you would get different numbers in different places, but you would always get a gap. Like even if you go in a gang and you survey the gang's comfort with use of violence, even though the whole gang is more comfortable with violence than the rest of us, they're uncomfortable with the amount of violence in their gang or heavy drinking. So it's a relative calculation, but the point is there's almost always a gap, and correcting the gap is a prevention tool. So if you're a bystander, you need to notice the event, interpret it as a problem, feel responsible, and have skills, right? And now we're here because we noticed the event. And we're here because we feel responsible, and your president is being very vocal that we all need to feel responsible, and now we have to figure out what are the skills that we need. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't intervene, but in general, the different reasons relate to a misreading of the situation of other people and how they would feel. So if we teach people to read the situation correctly, they will be less inhibited from intervening. So you could talk to the person or the other bystanders. You could say, what do you think of that comment Alan made about passive-aggressive Minnesotans? and you could see if other people felt okay with it. And then you have different way. You can do something later. You can say something now, or you can talk to someone later. You can confront someone, which is more direct. But as I said, you can do something more indirect, like make a positive comment to replace a negative. And you could have a conversation with that person, say, "It's Alan, it seems that it would really bother you if we hired another woman in the department. I'm curious why you don't like that." And you could have a private, personal conversation with me to kind of try and understand where I'm coming from, and then share how you feel. I'm going to jump through a lot of these. The point here is that you don't intervene the same way in every situation, so it needs to be situation specific. That confrontation is more direct, whereas not participating, changing the subject, or replacing a negative comment with a positive can be very effective. Some people feel that this is a cop-out, because you're not really dealing with the situation, but the point is, doing something is always better than doing nothing, and if enough people do something, it will have a cumulative effect. Or, as I said, you could have a conversation with the person and understand why it bothers them. Like maybe my first supervisor was female, and I felt she unfairly rated me, and I lost a job promotion. So I have like what we would call as a chip on my shoulder, and I'm acting it out in our hiring process. And if you could sympathize with my experience and say, that sounds really unfair, and that, I understand how you feel, but I wouldn't want to exclude a really qualified female candidate just because you had a bad experience with your, supervisor. So am I going to intervene or not? Am I going to do it now or later? Am I going to do it with the person or talk to the other bystanders? If I do it with the person, how am I going to talk to them? If I talk to the other bystanders, I'm going to find out how they felt about it. If they're willing to do something, who's the best person to do something? And then one of us does something. But also what we leave out is after we do something, we can go back and ask the other bystanders, how do you think I handled that? Did that work out well? Would you have done something differently? What would you have done if I hadn't been here? So this is the workshop tomorrow. It's a 3-hour workshop on this. The research shows that most bystander intervention trainings rebound after 1 year, which means the effect goes away. So they're not sustained. So we have to figure out a way to teach people the skills and then supervise them, mentor them, talk to them, give them feedback, say, well, that really didn't work, so what if you had tried this? In other words, it's not a one-time event. Most of the bystander efforts on college campuses now are one-time events. So they have a temporary effect and then they dissolve away. Because violence is gendered, we know that separate gender programs can be very effective, and we focus on bystanders and preferably with peers. And we always need to acknowledge that men can be victims as well. And there's special barriers for male victims to come forward. If we're talking about men's role in prevention, we say we need your help, this is a really important problem, and I know that you can make a difference. It turns out that most men are uncomfortable with the way we've been taught to be men, but we think other men don't. Like, I might want to cry at a movie, but I might not cry because I think other people will judge me. So if I know that most guys think it's okay to cry at a movie, then I'll, get the Kleenex. So we need to make it public that there's many aspects of men's socialization that men don't like. So we want to move this campus and all the other campuses in the state through these systems, through these stages. And we know that these are two great tools that we have, the social norms approach and bystander intervention, that they both work better together than separate. So taking an online course is not an interactive, tailored program, right? So it's not a best practice. We try and make it as tailored to the audience as possible. So you have one for undergraduates, you might have one for graduate students, you might have one for all of you, but it's only one part of a comprehensive program. If you follow the online training with an interactive program that refers back to the online training, or you talk about it in your classes, then you're creating more opportunity for change. So I'm going to really go quick now, but I wanted to show you some examples of programs that have combined both. So I developed a rape prevention program that one of my colleagues tested with the CDC grant, and it was very interesting. Sexual assaults went down by 75% in 6 months. And what we found is that the men felt that other men would be more willing to intervene. This is in a college residence hall. The men felt less reinforcement for sexually aggressive men, and they associated less with them. Imagine, like we're all freshmen, and I want you to all come in my room and watch my porn films, and in the beginning you all come because you think that everyone else wants to come, and now none of you come because you know that none of you want to come. So I'm alone. So by correcting all the misperceptions, we created an environment where the guys were less likely to perp, but after 6 months it rebounded. So the idea is the best program in the world isn't enough. If I was willing to say this is the best program in the world, which I'm not, I'm willing to say this is a very good evidence-based program that we believe is effective. It's not enough by itself. Now it's interesting because we didn't talk about pornography, but pornography use went down. So we call that a ripple effect, which is even though we never mentioned the word pornography, because most guys don't like pornography, by reconfiguring the norms and correcting the perceptions, it gave people more permission to be themselves, and they were less likely to consume pornography. So we asked high school guys, do you agree or disagree? And most guys don't like guys trash-talking girls, but most guys underestimate how much other guys don't like it. So here's the poster. 4 to 5 guys don't want to hear trash talk about girls. Here's what they do about it. Now, obviously, now we want to train people in bystander intervention so people actually do, right? And it's interesting because this campaign emphasized healthy relationships. And what they found after they did this campaign is they had more students reporting that they knew someone in an abusive relationship because the students were more able to identify an unhealthy relationship by being normed about what is a healthy relationship. So they had some good outcomes. This is a fraternity sorority program at the University of Missouri, and they do all the things I'm talking about, and they collect data on the norms. And what I think is really brilliant, they say, when would you want a sister in your sorority to intervene against you? So it's like I'm all giving you permission to say something to me when I do something stupid. So for example, 73% of this fraternity is very upset when they notice someone bothering someone, but they underestimate other people's being very upset, right? So you can spend all day just reading the research on misperceptions. It's about spirituality, it's about religious behavior, it's about ecological behavior, it's about gambling, you name it. So in this sorority, everyone said, I want you to do something when I do this. So that's really lowering the barriers, right, to bystander intervention. And then they also paired this with the media campaign, which would be an interactive workshop reinforced by a media campaign that everyone sees. And they showed that people were more willing to intervene. And then I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the leaders, the more influence you have, the more you influence the environment. So the leader's influence is great, and very often the leader is what we call in the misperception. The leader talks about your students as if most of them are drinking too much or most of them are having sex all the time. And it turns out when we do this in high school that the high school teachers believe in all the stereotypes of the high school students that the high school students believe in. So even though you're not engaging in the behavior, you're part of the problem. We're part of the problem. And obviously the leader creates the environment that supports bystanders to intervene and supports victims to come forward by the way they talk about the issue. So as I said, if we just quote your president, it just sounds like he's saying the same worn out things that everyone says that we won't tolerate and one is too much, but his actions show that it's serious. So, a lot of things that determine the successfulness of a program that I'm not going to review because we had a great discussion about other things that were more important for the moment. So we want to support healthy norms. We want to encourage people to intervene. We want to avoid focusing too much on the negative and on scare tactics, which don't work. We want to inhibit problem behavior. We want to create programs that are mutually reinforcing, synergistic, and consistent for both prevention and response. Now, at an institution this big, it's going to be very complicated. And the situation of a graduate student with an inappropriate faculty member is similar but different from a secretary in an office with a supervisor, or an athlete on one of your teams, or two students, or two fellow employees, or females who work in predominantly male environments, which are very high-risk environments for these types of things. So you can't just do one thing for the whole institution and all the campuses in the system. You need to develop tailored responses in your different places, and as someone pointed out, you need to identify who are the individuals who are vulnerable and feel marginalized in those different groups. So, for instance, in certain disciplines which are traditionally underrepresented for females, we need to, or we have more international students, we have to tailor, and it depends on where those international students are from. So that's why you're all part of the solution, is you're all here to help us all figure out what works best where. Okay, so going back to, for the first time in 8 years, our survey shows that everything is going down, and we don't know why, but we think we've been doing good things for 8 years at a similarly large place. Now, the fun thing here is if we engage a lot of your faculty or enough of your faculty in this research effort, you can be evaluating things as we go along, and we really can contribute to the knowledge base internationally about all these things. So the good thing is that this campus is doing more of these things than most campuses do. So you have like a good prognosis, but right, there's no guarantees because we're only in the beginning. So I write boring articles, as some of the people in the room do, and they're on my website if you should be interested. And if you were so interested, you would see that I didn't make this up, but that there's a lot of research that I'm sharing with you. But I didn't think it was worth my time or your time to cite studies and go through methodological things. This is just like the state of the art, and it is now time for us to move on to the rest of the day, which will involve a lot of you in panels and a lot of good brainstorming. The visit, I'm here until Thursday afternoon, is a very well thought out, well-designed visit of how to take advantage of all of your expertises and knowledge, including the other campuses in the system who, I'm sorry for those of you who couldn't be here physically because of the snow, as well as for me to chime in, hopefully in a helpful way when I have something to contribute to the discussion. So thank you all very much, and I hope we keep having productive moments together.